sounds the first couple of weeks here. Just the music that we sing is beautiful. And I made a comment in the first service, and I'll say this for everybody that's singing during the whole Christmas season. But you heard Michael sing, and then you're going to hear Patrick at the end, and we've got some of the other vocalists that we'll see throughout the month. And I just wish Joe would find some people who could really sing, up on the stage. Goodness gracious, I'm so grateful for the talent we have, and people's willingness to use that talent in a time like this is really great. So anyway, we're going to continue to listen to some of the sounds of Christmas, but today is one of those things that's about a sight of Christmas. And I'm going to talk about a very unique Christmas tree. Christmas trees are all part of what we see at Christmas time. They're everywhere. Obviously, you come into this auditorium, they're everywhere up here. Trees everywhere. And I got to looking at, there's a song that a lot of you know about. It's entitled, Oh Christmas Tree. I don't know if you ever really looked at the lyrics of that or not. But it goes, oh Christmas tree, thy leaves are so unchanging. I stopped right there and think, do I see any leaves on any of these trees, or you see any on these evergreens, But so the writer, I realize, taking poetic license here, but oh Christmas tree, thy leaves are so unchanging, not only green when summer's here, but also when it's cold and drear. Oh Christmas tree, thy leaves are so unchanging. Then he goes on and says, oh Christmas tree, how richly God has decked thee. O Christmas tree, how richly God has decked thee. Thou bidst us true and faithful be, and trust in God unchangingly. O Christmas tree, how richly God has decked thee. In that one little section there, it said, thou bidst us true and faithful be, and trust in God unchangingly. I've never had a tree motivate me to think those kind of thoughts. Have you? I just kind of think that's a bit of a stretch there on that, but I understand they're using poetic license, and they're understanding the symbolism that they're trying to use there. But when I think of a Christmas tree, I don't necessarily think of the reverence of that tree. And, as an illustration of that, I remember when Shelley and I, it's our second year of being married, we found a cat. And some of you who've been with me for a while know that we had a cat named Max. And Max was a great cat. I was not a cat person growing up. I was a dog person. Shelley had dog and cats, but Max converted me to a cat person. He was great. Fantastic cat. He had personality, though. The first Christmas tree we put up, we went out in the woods and got it, put it up in our house, decked it all out. Shelley had it all just the way she wanted it and everything, and beautifully lit, and went to bed that night. Got up the next morning, I walked out, and all the strands of light were strung across the living room. And I looked at that, and then I looked back at the tree, and it was amazing. Not one ornament was knocked off the tree. Now, how meticulous that cat was, to figure out how to do that without knocking a single ornament off. And then as I looked real close into the tree, there were a pair of eyes peering out at me. He had a lot of character. We love Max, but he didn't obviously have very much reverence for the Christmas tree. But what is it about the Christmas tree? Is it just something we put up that's pretty during the Christmas season, or is there some significance? And when I did some history study on it, I found out there was significance as how the tree became a part of a Christmas tradition. When I think back through the years about a Christmas tree, I go back clear to right after the time of Christ when the Romans were ruling the world. And they had this time that came up December 17th through the 24th every year. They called it Saturnaria. And during that time period, they would decorate trees with just metal objects, shiny objects, And then it was all in honor of their god, Bacchus. He was the god of fertility. And so they were recognizing him, and they gave gifts to each other. And so it was clear back then that some of these traditions were getting started. And then you come up to the medieval times, and the Germans had what they called the paradise tree. And it was decorated with cookies and apples, and sometimes they put candles on there, and they would make sure the tree was really pretty. And sometimes it was not so much a real tree that they would do. They would build a pyramid out of just wood, and it looked like it had shelves on it. And they would decorate it with greenery. And then they'd put various objects on there that meant something to them that they thought represented life. And so this finally merged into a Christmas tree out of Germany and Scandinavian countries. They all began to recognize that an evergreen represents life. And so we're talking about the life of Christ. We're talking about the life he brings to earth. So they began to use a Christmas tree as a symbol of life. So it was not just there because it was pretty and you could decorate it. There was some meaning to it. But perhaps one of my favorite stories was St. Boniface in the 8th century. He went out and cut down an oak tree, which was almost unheard of at that time because oak tree was revered as being holy, somehow sacred. But he cut down an oak tree, and as it was falling down, it split in 4 different sections as it fell down, and inside the tree was growing an evergreen, so the legend says. And he went out and told people that and said, this is a sign that the pagan stuff is going to go to the side, and something new is coming that we're going to recognize, and it's this evergreen. And he began to attach that to the life that you have in Christ. So there is some stuff that's gone on throughout history that indicates there was a significant reason why they began to choose a tree at Christmas time as part of the celebration of the birth of Christ. So I just thought I'd share some of that with you as background, that when I think about Christmas, I think about this background, whether it's a Roman origin, German, Scandinavian, or just the legend of St. Boniface. But think about the one on St. Boniface. Would that be weird to cut a tree down as it falls? In the middle of that tree is growing some kind of an evergreen? That would catch your attention, wouldn't it? Well, it caught the attention, at least symbolically, of the prophet Isaiah. Because in the 11th chapter of the book of Isaiah, he talks a little bit about that. And it's what he comes to as a point of where he's mentioning to us the incarnation of life in a royal stump. In a royal stump. Now, that stump would recognize a symbolic thing about the Assyrians who were ruling the world at that time. They came sweeping down through the Middle East and came through Judea, Palestine, and as they did, they conquered everything in sight. And a lot of times they would just absolutely raze everything. That was the culture. They wanted to do away with the culture. You're going to live by Assyrian culture now. So the Jewish people had to tolerate the Assyrians coming in and just absolutely tearing up their land. And so I imagine with battles and wars that went on, there were lots of stumps around. They leveled everything. And yet Isaiah says, I think there's one stump that's significant, because in that stump I saw a tender shoot come out of that. You usually don't see that kind of a thing. Now, I've looked at it a little bit biologically, and I found out it does happen. Rarely it can happen. But this is something Isaiah was looking at. In all this destruction around him, there's this stump, and out of that stump comes a little shoot, a sign of life. And he wants to comment about that kind of a thing. So in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 5, he writes these words. Out of the stump of David's family, and by the way, some translations just read out of Jesse's stump, because Jesse was the father of David, okay? But out of the stump of David's family will grow a shoot, yes, a new branch bearing fruit from the old root. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, and the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. He will delight in obeying the Lord. He will not judge by appearance, nor make a decision based on hearsay. He will give justice to the poor and make fair decisions for the exploited. The earth will shake at the force of his word, and one breath from his mouth will destroy the wicked. He will wear righteousness like a belt and truth like an undergarment. Now, as you study throughout the rest of Scripture, some of these images that he just said here in these first 5 verses, those fit Jesus Christ. He is the one who comes with understanding. He comes with counsel and might. And yes, and he can speak and things can just be destroyed if he wants to. He's powerful, but he's also caring. And he loves the people who are down and out, the heartbroken. He comes to help them out. But it all comes from Jesse's family. Now, this goes all the way back in the Old Testament, where it starts with Abraham. And out of Abraham's lineage, out of his family tree, if you will come one who will be a blessing to all the nations. Jesse's in the middle of all that, and his son David would become the great king over Israel, and a direct link right to Jesus Christ. Now, I know that's the case because when I go down in the family tree, I go over to the book of Matthew chapter 1, and I know a lot of people skip about the first 14 verses of Matthew 1 because they think, oh, that's nothing more than all those begats, or so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so, and they go on and on through all these different generations like that. But when you come down in chapter 1 to verse number 6, it says, Jesse was the father of King David. And that's noteworthy because it is Jesse's stump that we're talking about in Isaiah chapter 11. It's that stump that it represents there's not going to be any life in Israel for a long, long time. Oh, yes, there is, because there's this little shoot that's growing up out of that stump. And it symbolically represents that the lineage is going to move forward, and there's going to come a Messiah. Well, as you move on down through Matthew chapter 1, you come down to verse 16. It says that Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Mary gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So significant stuff that's going on between Isaiah and Matthew there that just simply tells us that there is a Messiah who's coming, who's going to be the hope of the world. There's going to be many times when the world is going to be in desperate straits, and there's lots of destruction, lots of hopelessness around. But always remember, God has this faithful lineage that's moving forward. And Jesus has already been here on earth, but what he left us, and we'll talk about that as we go through this message today, is life. Life. If you will, the evergreen, the symbol of life. Jesus leaves us life because he is Messiah. Life came when he chose to become one of us. Life came to this world. I read a story some time ago about a sheriff, and the sheriff was out in Salt Lake City, and he was giving some instruction on some police work to some of his officers that were in a library in Salt Lake City. He was just dressed in his plain clothes. He was not wearing his uniform that day. And he stepped out for just a second, gave some assignment for those guys to do. And as he stepped out of the room for just a second, he saw something going on just out in the hallway there. There was a man with a gun. And he'd herded about 18 people together, was herding them into a room. And so the sheriff understood exactly what was going on. And he, because he had plain clothes on, he just got into that group of hostages and went into this room. And he stayed fairly close to where the gunman was as the gunman walked into the room. And then the gunman began to announce the order in which people were going to be executed. And it was about that time when he took his eye off of this sheriff for just a second that the sheriff jumped him. And there was a scuffle that took place. And the sheriff, in just kind of a self-protective mode, shot and killed the assailant. And all 18 people were able to walk out of that room. Now, why would I tell a story like that? Because that's exactly what Jesus did. Exactly what he did. We were all being held hostage to sin. There was destruction of what sin does in people's lives, and sometimes we see it just physically because of war and everything. We see all the evil in the world, and we're all held hostage to that evil. And Jesus came as one of us. He didn't come in regal robes or anything. I mean, we talk about it all the time. Born in a little stable, for crying out loud. Nobody would think anything about this baby, born among livestock. He came as one of us, lived among us, and then he got the jump on Satan. When he went to the cross and died on the cross, he was able to set us free from being hostages. That's what Jesus did. And that was what was prophesied by Isaiah. He talked about looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. And when he did, he saw all the good and all the life that would come into this world because of the Messiah. St. Athanasius made this comment one time. He became what we are that he might make us what he is. Let me read that again. He became what we are that he might make us what he is. Not people victimized by sin. Not people who were going to go through a period of time and then you die and that's it. He came to bring us life and to live life like he lives it. That's what Jesus was all about. That's the incarnation of life that comes out of this stump. He was the branch that brought life into this world. Well, I would also tell you, though, as I think about this, there's benefits of this life. When we hook into that life that Jesus brought to this world, there's lots of benefit. You know, when I go back to Isaiah and I look at chapter 11 once again, I want to look at verses 2 and 4. Look at those verses with me once again. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, this one who is this branch, this shoot that comes up out of the stump of Jesse, that the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will give justice to the poor and make fair decisions for the exploited. Whatever's wrong in the world, he's going to set it right. And he's given us the foundation of how that works together. We can see it. Now, he'll do it when everything is said and done on this planet, when God allows everything to happen that's supposed to happen. He's going to send Jesus back again. And everything that I just read is going to happen in its fullest form. But right now, we can see through Jesus Christ what we can do to make this world a better world. There can be better understanding and wisdom. There can be counsel that's good and mighty. There can be this thing about justice for the poor, and those people who are exploited, we help them. That's all what Jesus did when he came here. That's the life he brought to this world. That's what he invites us into. So Christmas is a whole lot more than going out and buying gifts for one another and trading them off on Christmas Day, as much fun as that is. It's a whole lot more than just decorations. As a matter of fact, I'm suggesting when you look at some of the decorations, like a tree, think about its history and why they even brought it in. It was a symbol of what Christ brought to this world, and it's life. It's life. We get to hook into that life. There's a fruit of life that we get to participate with. How do I know this is true? Well, the words of Jesus. Go back to the Gospel of John, and in the 15th chapter, verse number 5, Jesus says this, "Yes, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me, and I in them, will produce much fruit, for apart from me, you can do nothing." What's the fruit that we can produce? Joy, peace, love, hope, all these things that the world desires and wants to have, but looking in all the wrong places for it. Looking for human understanding that they're not going to find it all there. Oh, glimpses perhaps, but if you really want to find all that I just mentioned, the hope and the joy and the peace and the love, if you want to really find that in its fullest form and live it out in its fullest form, that's only through Jesus Christ, and it's only being attached to him. We get to be part of the tree. The stump grew into a tree named Jesus Christ, and we get to attach to him. He says, you're just attached to me like a branch. And if you are, I'll put that fruit in you, and you can live that fruit out among all the rest of the people in the world. So, the benefits of life is simply the fruit that he came to bring, that we can have in our lives to make a difference in this world. But I want to suggest to you, as we think about this concept of the tree of life, if you will, and the evergreen symbolizes that life really does come through another tree. It really comes through another tree. Our new life is possible only because of a tree that was not pretty. The tree on which Jesus died. Oh, it was wood. And it didn't look like a tree sticking up out of the ground. It was wood, though. But it wasn't very pretty. It was a symbol of execution. And he became one of those who was executed on a tree like that. But real life comes from that tree. A symbol of death. But real life comes through what was accomplished on that tree. Look at the book of Isaiah, going back. I was just sticking with the prophet today. Going back to Isaiah chapter 53. It's known as the suffering servant passage in the Bible. It talks all about, it doesn't mention Jesus by name, but everything it describes is what Jesus went through on the cross and what people saw when they looked at him on the cross. And so I want to look at verses 2 and part of verse number 8. It says, "My servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot." Isaiah continuing that theme there of this shoot that comes up out of the ground, out of the stump. "And there was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. He was unjustly condemned. He was led away. And no one cared that he died without descendants." When you look at the symbol of execution in the Roman times, a horrible death, it was ugly. And when you put a person on that cross, they were usually beaten up, almost disfigured to the point you couldn't recognize them, and they were left there to die, sometimes taking days. Well, I think Isaiah had a picture in his mind about there was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, that nothing that would attract us to him. As a matter of fact, people would turn their eyes away from him because it was hideous to see what Jesus had become on that cross. And he was unjustly condemned. He didn't do a thing to deserve to be there, other than he took on our sins, which the Romans didn't care about. The Jewish people, the leaders, didn't care about. God knew it, though, what he was doing. He was taking all the sins of the world. Everything that we'd ever do that would be against God, he died. Because, you see, the penalty for us when we disobey God is death. Jesus says, I'll die for him. So life comes through, strangely, comes through a different tree. Not a Christmas tree, but a crucifixion tree. And he died for us. Look at chapter 1 of the book of John, the Gospel of John. John says this as he gives his prologue to his gospel, and he's talking about the Word, and the Word is identified as Jesus Christ. But he says in verse number 4, the Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. That was his purpose. He came to give us life. A lot of people in the world say, oh, I'm living. I'm not doing too bad or anything like that. I had a professor who used to say, all real living is meeting the resurrected Lord. Until you meet the resurrected Lord, you're just sucking air. Life really is understood in its fullest form when you're connected to Jesus Christ. Jesus knows, you see, all about our suffering. He knows all about those things that drag us down and eventually lead us to death. But he wants to offer to us life in this world and the hope of eternal life. All that was in the mind of God when he sent Jesus to die for us. He became one of us, and he died. What does the impact matter to us in this life? Philip Yancey is a great Christian writer. He talks about his wife. Used to go to volunteer at a nursing home, and she led a little Christian circle, they called it. And there was an Alzheimer's patient that was in that little circle. Her name was Betsy, and she faithfully attended every week. She was led there by a staff worker, and she would sit through the hour. And every week, Janet introduced, and Janet is Philip Yancey's wife, she introduces herself, and every week Betsy responds as if she's never met her before because she just couldn't remember. So a few weeks later, Janet learned that Betsy had retained the ability to read. Now, everything else got mixed up, and she couldn't remember a lot of stuff, but she remembered how to read. She had no comprehension of what she was reading, but she could read. And at times, she would read a line, and then she'd repeat the line and over like a broken record until you move it, Kind of move it. And they'd say, move on to the next line, so she'd read the next line. But on a good day, she could read a passage straight through in a clear, strong voice, and Janet began calling on each week this lady, Betsy, to read a hymn. So one Friday, the senior citizens who really liked the old hymns, they said, hey, we know one that all of us like real well, and you're going to know it too. It's called The Old Rugged Cross. And they asked Betsy to read it. So she started reading. She said, on a hill far away stands an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And when she got those words out of her mouth, she just stopped. She suddenly got very agitated. She says, I can't go on. It's too sad. I can't go on. So people who were in that room were amazed at what she was saying because she couldn't put words together like that unless she was reading. But she was saying, I can't go on. This is too sad. So in years of living at the home, not once had Betsy shown the ability to put words together meaningfully, but everybody sat back and listened to her expressing herself at this point. And she tried then to read again. But when she got to those words, suffering and shame, she would stop and say, I can't go on, it's too sad. Finally, when Betsy got quiet, Janet says, okay, let's go back to your room. So she helped her back to the elevator where they were going to go back to her room. And to her amazement, Betsy began singing the hymn from memory. And the words came in breathy, chopped phrases, and you could barely hear the tune, but anyone could recognize what she was singing. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame, and tears began to fall down from her face. And she didn't stop this time. She gained strength, and she said, and I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. And here's what Phil Yancey writes about in his book. Somewhere in that tattered mind, damaged neurons had tapped into a network of old connections to resurrect a pattern of meaning for Betsy. In her confusion, two things stood out. She could identify suffering and shame. Those two words summarize really, though, the human condition. The condition she lives in every day of her sad life. Who knows more suffering and shame than Betsy? For her, the hymn answered that question. Jesus does. And that's the hope for all of us. He came into this world to deal with our suffering and shame that sin brings into our lives, to do away with that, and in place of that, he gives us life. And so when you look at a Christmas tree, perhaps think about that symbolizes life that Christ brought into this world. So when you look at the cradle, the manger scene, we don't see Christmas trees there, but think about life is symbolized in that baby. He came to bring us life. The conclusion is pretty simple. You can have a new and real life rooted in Jesus. And I use the word rooted on purpose. When you get hooked up with him, you become part of that tree that he is. You get the fruit of everything he has to offer for you in life. And it's not just, well, I get to go to heaven someday. No, he starts living the life through you now. You're tapped into him, his power, his way of looking at life, his way of living. And life becomes better. And so the stump that Jesse produced also produced a shoot that was named Jesus Christ. And he died on a very different tree, a very unique tree, to give us the hope of life. So this Christmas, celebrate what God did with the stump. A stump that most folks would walk away from, but a stump that had something strange going on. It had a shoot that came up, symbolic of what would come through Jesus Christ. It produced a king that produced sons and daughters like you and me. What a beautiful tree, but also what a very unique Christmas tree. Beyond what we see on a stage, that tree is unique for what it does for us. So I think we ought to be able to say to God as we come through Christmas time, I do appreciate what you've done. I see what Christmas really means. And we can have fun and do the things we normally do, but to really understand, even in a symbol of a Christmas tree, this is what it's all about. His death produced life for all of us. And so at this time of Christmas, when we celebrate the birth of Christ once again, we're really saying to him, welcome to our world. He came a long time ago, but we still say, welcome to our world, because of all that he brings with him when he comes. So we're going to close right now with a song that Patrick's going to come and sing for us, Michael W. Smith's song from years ago, and it's simply entitled, Welcome to Our World. Lyrics will be on the screen. I suggest as you listen to it, it's a beautiful song, but look at the lyrics very closely too. You know why? Because that's the power of Christmas, what you'll see there. Listen as Patrick sings.